Okay, let's get to YouTube. This is gonna do us no favors with the YouTube gods, so I usually save this to the end, but just so you guys know, we've been having demonetization hell, and this is part of it, which is that the censorship regime, which is essentially beginning to be put into place under the guise of COVID, is extraordinarily troubling. And I'll say at the top, I don't have a lot of sympathy for some of the people who are affected right now, and that's the key. So YouTube has put out a new policy on vaccine misinformation where they say they will be removing altogether the channels, videos, and more aggressively, not just about the COVID vaccine, but against all vaccines generally. That includes people like Robert Kennedy Jr., many other prominent. They say that they've traced the source of a lot of anti-vax content towards these particular creators. But the language through which they justify this policy, Krystal, is always what we have to look at. Under what guise are you saying that this has to be true? Michael Tracy actually pointed this out quite well. Let's put this on the screen. So what Tracy points to, and you go within the YouTube announcement, is that they say, as with our COVID guidelines, we consulted with local and international health organizations and experts in developing these policies. Our guidance on vaccine side effects maps to public vaccine resources provided by health authorities, backed by medical consensus. So the important point here is that they are pointing to, quote, medical consensus as the burden through which they are gonna go and then remove content. Not just remove content, but effectively banish you from their platform. Do I cry for Robert Kennedy Jr., Robert RFK Jr.? No, I think he's one of the most pernicious actors in the entire space. And I know all the anti-vaxxers will hate me for it, but I don't really care. It's not about him specifically. I'm not speaking out on behalf of him. I'm pointing to the fact that it was medical consensus not that long ago in this country that the lab leak hypothesis was a complete farce and completely without merit. And under this guise, lab leak videos, many of which I've done here, many of which I did at Rising, could be removed. They could be removed under medical consensus. It's same thing whenever it comes to masks back in February of 2020. The medical consensus at the time with the experts said that masks don't work. And then they changed their mind. That's okay, it happens. You know, it's all good. But remember, the standards that we enforce here and under the guise and the language of all of that, it matters a lot. And so, yes, I know this will definitely not help us in our goal in making sure that this show has as big a reach as possible, but you can't help but look at this and not be afraid under the guise of which they're trying to enforce this, given the fact that, once again, you can have no sympathy for those people who are impacted. Look at the policy itself and say, this is a big problem.
This is a very significant escalation. Because what you're seeing with these anti-vax activists, is with how they're described, they're not just taking down the content that's problematic, they're saying you're off the platform altogether.
Forever. Right.
That's a significant escalation here. And I think what you're pointing to is two things. Number one, you trust YouTube to be the arbiters of science and medicine and fact, because I certainly don't. Not only, would I not trust any sort of single person or entity to serve as the gatekeeper of truth and fiction, but YouTube is a capitalistic enterprise with their own interests at stake. And you don't think that they're gonna, lean into what they see as in their political and, more important, profit-making interest? Of course they are. Of course they are. So we're not talking about like they're a disinterested party here. Of course they're an interested party. And so that inserts bias into the process from the start. Second of all, as you're pointing to, sometimes there's a clear medical consensus and sometimes there's not. Sometimes there's a debate. Sometimes there's an initial consensus that turns out to be wrong. On masks, a great example. Lab leak, another great example, okay? Now, sometimes those things are sort of intentionally fueled, as was with lab leak, to cover the tracks of people who may have been complicit. And sometimes it's just genuinely, it looked like the research was heading in this direction. This is what we thought. We've got new research in. It's better. Here's where we are now. I'll give you a perfect example that's playing out right now. And I know you guys can relate to this because COVID is still relatively new. There's still a lot of question marks about what are in fact the best mitigation strategies, what works in public settings, what works in school settings, and we still don't have the answers to a lot of those questions. So even on something like mask wearing in schools and whether that is effective at stopping the spread, There are some studies that say yes, and there are some studies that say it's not really that effective. There is no medical consensus today. Another perfect example that we have covered closely and that has been playing out in the public sphere. Booster shots. Are booster shots necessary? Are they necessary for the general population? Are they necessary for the elderly population? Are they necessary for really no one? There's a lot of conflicting information there. There was data that came out of Israel that say, hey, this was useful for elderly people, at least for some period of time. There was a group of scientists who came out and said, you know, for the general population, this is really not necessary. And then you have some within the Biden administration who said, look, I think everybody may as well go get the booster shot. There is no set medical consensus on booster shots today. So YouTube, how are you going to deal with that? You know, and this is not an uncommon thing. So they put this language like it's going to be really cut and dry. And in certain extreme examples, like if you're just saying vaccines don't work, obviously there's a medical consensus against that notion. But there are a lot more very borderline cases. And then what this all ends up doing is it's not really going to lead to more accurate information being put out. What it means is they're going to crush independent creators. I mean, if you're a new channel starting out today and you don't already have a following, it is so much harder. It's virtually impossible to get going and build the audience that was possible, you know, just a few years ago and certainly 10 years ago. It's just not the same open platform that it used to be. They explicitly say that they want to recommend now what they call trusted news sources. That means places like CNN and the New York Times, et cetera, that we know have been caught in plenty of lies and misinformation and medical inaccuracies, but they don't care when it's their quote unquote trusted news sources. Then it's okay. So it really does make it much more difficult for independent voices and creators to be able to break through, build an audience, build a platform, and provide information to the public, which is what YouTube was supposed to be all about.
I mean, look at us. We covered the news, and this is, I keep talking about this, but I will not stop until I see some sort of fix. Sometimes the news is bad. Yesterday, we covered R. Kelly, and it was really gross. And that segment was demonetized, not suitable for advertisers, even after a human review. When we covered 9/11, those segments were demonetized. Whenever we cover Jeffrey Epstein, those segments are demonetized. Whenever, I could go on and on. Any controversial subject, vaccines now, anything on vaccines, absolute demonetization. Now, if you are us of a couple of years ago, what do? We are lucky. We have our premium subscribers. We know we can cover whatever we want, and if a segment gets demonetized, so be it. Some people out there, they're not like that. They have to rely on the ad dollars in order to float themselves.
We kind of snuck through under the radar at the Hill.
That's true.
Because we had this corporate brand over us.
There you go.
So we were treated differently. I mean, there's no doubt. We see it. Like the way that we were treated there versus now that we're independent, it's definitely a different world. So we have the direct comparison there. And I do think that's part of how we were able to find success and ultimately break through. But if you're just getting started and you have something to say and you have something to contribute, forget about it. It's very, very difficult on YouTube. And again, that's what the platform was supposed to be all about from the beginning. But and then the other piece of this is, of course, like some of the worst actors are never satisfied. It's never enough for them that there's more censorship. We can throw this tweet up on the screen of
Andy
Slavitt, who says, okay, YouTube eliminated misinformation on vaccines. Facebook, you're a move. So it's never enough. They always want more and more and more censorship, which is just, it's not the direction that you want to go in a free society. I'll just say that. And it's kind of giving up on believing that you can ultimately win the debate.
Well, it matters because Andy Slavitt was working at the White House as of like a couple of weeks ago as their COVID response director. And he was one of the people inside the White House who, if you guys remember, when they were pushing Jen Psaki to come out there, call Facebook out and say, Facebook, you need to do exactly what we tell you to do. And not only that, if you're banned from one platform, you should be banned from all platforms. Do you remember that? That's the official policy of the United States government. And now they are now pushing that whenever it comes to YouTube. And like I said, do I have sympathy for the individual actors who were, affected by this particular policy? No, I don't. I think they should rot in hell, specifically RFK Jr. But that doesn't mean that the policy itself cannot be applied broadly in these edge cases, which are going to stifle debate. And look, moderation at this scale is incredibly difficult. And that is why whenever it starts to become public, we all need to come up with a set of rules which we can agree on, and that this is enforced fairly and this is not. Whether it should be involved the government, Congress, whatever, that's all for debate. But that actually is a debate that we really need to have in this country.
Indeed. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it, you get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.